so much of our politics was defined by that term woke. Where did woke begin? Obviously, 30 or 40, 50, 60 years ago via the Frankfurt School, critical theory. But there was a moment during COVID where it seemed as if the entire society exploded. There was a moment that was caught on video that triggered what is now known as Floydapalooza. We weren't allowed to think about it at the time. We were only allowed to feel. We weren't allowed to ask very simple questions about what's really going on here. And as a result, the man in the video, Derek Chauvin, is now going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Well, now further examination allows us to reanalyze this cultural flashpoint. And a very brave man when it comes to this particular topic, and a great man, Ben Shapiro, is willing to speak out and not just ask the question, but advocate for a pardon for Derek Chauvin. Joining us now is Ben Shapiro, host of The Ben Shapiro Show, and also the website is pardonderek.com, co-founder of The Daily Wire. Ben, welcome to the program.
Hey, Charlie. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
So, Ben, I'm going to just say the floor is yours. For some people that have not been following this with great detail, this might make them kind of take a second, like a little pause and a second beat. Why are you advocating for Derek Chauvin's pardon? And what have you learned through the course of your research and your rigorous pursuit of the truth that has led you to this advocacy?
Well, I think the reason that I'm advocating for the pardon is because Derek Chauvin is not guilty. And I think that it's very important to explode narratives like the one that you were talking about, because those narratives live on in our memory as sort of flashpoints that people draw upon as evidence of narratives that are false. So the narrative that surrounded the Floyd Chauvin killing was the narrative that America was inherently racist. Now, those allegations were never actually made at trial. There was never any allegation by prosecutors or by anyone that Derek Chauvin, quote unquote, killed George Floyd because George Floyd was black. And yet that was the narrative that burst out all over the country, that systemic American policing was racist, that America had to undergo a sort of racial cleansing process that allowed for $2 billion in rioting. In fact, a process that was so important that even if COVID was spreading around, you were allowed to take off your mask and shout in the streets for George Floyd, and you would somehow be free of COVID for doing all of these things. We all remember this. It was really a quite terrible time in American history, and it was being excused by the entire left, all of the legacy media. And in fact, if you didn't post the black square in favor of Black Lives Matter, you were basically non-personed in terms of sort of social media and the way that you were approached in all of these spaces. Now, the reality of this particular death is now known, and we know pretty much everything there is to know about it. And there are a bunch of reasons why Derek Chauvin should be pardoned. By the way, while in federal custody, he was stabbed recently 21 times by a fellow inmate. So it's quite dangerous for him. The reason why we now know all of this is because we know from jurors that they were pressured, that they felt the pressure, that they were scared to rule in favor of Derek Chauvin. We now know, and we could see it at the time, the amount of public pressure that was brought in that particular case. The mayor of Minneapolis was signing settlements with the family of George Floyd on behalf of the city in the middle of the trial. The governor of Minnesota at the time was, of course, Tim Walz. And Tim Walz was basically out there proclaiming the guilt of Derek Chauvin. Joe Biden was running for president at the time, it was 2020. And he and the rest of the Democratic regime were talking about how Derek Chauvin how this was a key flashpoint in American history, and how this was demonstrating sort of the apex moment of all of American racism contained in this particular incident. So the first clue that this was not true came, I think, from the fact that it was deemed an incident of American racism, and never did anyone ever make a claim. There were not even federal hate crime charges. There was no claim that Derek Chauvin, quote unquote, killed George Floyd because he was racist. Then you start to look more into the details of the actual death of George Floyd. Everything from the autopsy report, the original medical examiner autopsy report suggested that he had died not of failure to breathe because of pressure put on him, but effectively of excited delirium, fentanyl overdose. The idea in the actual autopsy report suggested that he had enough fentanyl in him that if he had just found this body on a sidewalk, the medical examiner, then he would have immediately determined that he had died of fentanyl overdose. We know from the actual tape. So there are sections of the tape that people thought they saw, the 8 minutes or 4 minutes of the 8-minute tape. And then there was a lot of tape before that. So if you actually look at the incident in its entirety, what you found out is that George Floyd was in a car outside of a place of business where he had passed a counterfeit bill. And the police came and arrived, and there's Derek Chauvin and the rest of the members of the officers who were there. And Derek Chauvin arrested George Floyd. And it appears that George Floyd either ingested drugs that were on him or he was already high. The reason that he might have ingested drugs is because literally a few years before, we also have videotape of George Floyd doing exactly that. He was arrested, and the officer had to force him to spit out the drugs. They arrest him. They take him out of his vehicle. They put him into the vehicle of the police officers. And a crowd is already gathering because this very often happens when there's a controversial police procedure that's happening. And George Floyd is put into the back of the police vehicle. He doesn't want to get in. He's complaining. He's saying that he's scared of being in the car, that he's claustrophobic and all the rest of this kind of stuff. He gets in, and immediately upon entering the car, he starts shouting that he can't breathe. Before he's on the ground, right? I can't breathe became sort of the matter of the moment, the phrase of the moment. People chanting, I can't breathe, in homage to George Floyd. He was saying he could not breathe from when he was in the car, suggesting either that it was untrue, that he could actually breathe, because normally if you can talk, you can breathe, or that he was already having difficulty breathing based on the fact that he had a very enlarged heart, that he had a lot of drugs in his system, and that he was actually having a medical issue before he was actually taken out of the car, by the way, at his request. At his request. He said, I don't want to be in the car. And so they said, okay, so they took him out of the car and they put him in prone position on the ground. Now, the Minneapolis police training model includes the sort of position that Derek Chauvin was using. This was introduced at trial. Derek Chauvin had been taught this by the Minneapolis Police Department. This is a normal procedure. In fact, much of the tape of him on George Floyd's quote unquote neck from a different angle is him on George Floyd's shoulder. This was admitted by witnesses for the prosecution. At some of that time, he was on George Floyd's shoulder. Now, at some point during that 8 minutes, George Floyd went non-responsive. It seems to be unclear to Chauvin when he was non-responsive. But there is no medical evidence that, for example, there was damage to his trachea, which would cut off the air. There was no bruising on his neck. So the autopsy and medical reports suggested, again, that at best, there is certainly reasonable doubt that he died because of the suppression technique specifically that Derek Chauvin was using. And so the entire trial was based on the supposition that simply by being put into the prone position and then Derek Chauvin being on his shoulder and then partially, not with his full weight, partially on his neck to suppress him, that this led to George Floyd's death in the form of murder, not even in the form of manslaughter, not even accidental death. Second-degree murder is what he was convicted of in state court. Okay, the evidence does not match up with this. And we covered this extensively at the time. And again, I was like everybody else when I first saw that tape. I think everybody, when they first saw the tape, they said, this is ugly, right? It looks ugly, because it turns out a lot of police procedure actually looks quite ugly. And so you can find tweets from me at the time saying this looks like bad policing by Derek Chauvin. So first of all, bad policing is not the same as second-degree murder. That's the first thing. But second of all, as the evidence emerged, the medical evidence emerged, the medical examiner's original report, new evidence that was emerging about his condition, new tape that was emerging, the backstory, all of it, as that emerged, it became clear that Derek Chauvin certainly was not guilty of second-degree murder, which is what he was charged with. There are all sorts of questions about the charges. As you recall, he was simultaneously charged with first and second-degree murder. Those are charges that are mutually exclusive, and yet they were both brought in an attempt to allow the jury to find a second-degree murder if they weren't going to find a first-degree murder. So there were all sorts of improprieties in the trial. Even if you just want to take this from a legal level, the idea that Derek Chauvin had, quote-unquote, a fair trial is wrong. The idea that the jury was impartial is wrong. The idea that there was evidence sufficient to suggest beyond a reasonable doubt that George Floyd was murdered in the second degree is wrong. We know for a fact that the entire narrative, which was drawn for the entire country, that America is systemically racist, was rooted in an incident in which race was not even alleged.
I want everyone to, I want to repeat that, everyone to internalize that. The 1619 Project was largely accelerated out of this. Robin DiAngelo's fame was born and out of this. We had police departments defunding the police. In fact, you can look at a material increase in crime in both Minneapolis and across the country because of this one incident. Not just the riots. We saw murder rates. We saw arson. We saw carjackings. We saw widespread gang violence because of one incident. And so, Ben, I want to compliment you for your willingness to speak out on this, because it wasn't just one injustice. This was the gateway drug towards mass anarchy in the streets and an unnecessary thousands of people dying on top of the baseline crime rate.